Welcome to Catch Outdoors, presented by the Waypoint Podcast Network at waypointtv.com. I'm your host, Captain Rob Modies, reporting to listeners each week from the fabulous Florida Keys. This podcast is centered around the great outdoors and includes topics on fishing, boating, beaching, bicycling, hiking, camping. Okay, you get it. So kick back for the next 40 minutes or so and get a taste of Florida and perhaps a few other distant outdoor locations. This week's episode is number 73. Let's go fishing. This will be a very Florida fishing-oriented podcast this week, so buckle up. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. First, there's some announcements. A great local bookstore called Sandbar Books, located in Tavernier Key, just down the road from me, added my books to their inventory in the local authors section, local Florida section, local state section. To say I'm happy about this would be an understatement. I've been shopping there since we moved back down this way this past summer. Great little / big bookstore. Check them out. They really are cool. I love bookstores. I love the way they smell when you walk in. I feel for kids and grandkids who may not have the pleasure of actually shopping in a bookstore. They're becoming fewer and fewer, and I'm anyone that, if they pop up, I'm clapping. I'm applauding for them. Whether I was an author or not, I read a lot, and I just love going to the bookstore and holding books in my hand, you know. Amazon's okay. I got books on Amazon. I get that. But, man, I love a bookstore. So be sure to check them out. They're also online at sandbarbookstore.com. You can follow them on Facebook and Instagram as well. You can also pick up my books at 239 Flies in Bonita Beach and at Lear's Economy Tackle in North Fort Myers. And, of course, on the web, as I mentioned, at amazon.com. And now on to episode number 73. I got several emails and questions about seasonal fishing in Florida, and it sort of all came at once. I have a funny feeling it has to do with turistas and snowbirds. I'm guessing that listen. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate that. So I'm going to do my best to break this down, mostly about the areas I'm familiar with, of course, and have fished in the past. Yes, we all have seasons here, but from Lake O, as in Okeechobee, on down, it really doesn't get all that cold. So water temperatures stay in a zone that allows us to fish year round. And however, there are some tweaks that have to be paid attention to, and to be successful at this, especially in the winter months. The impression that a lot of tourists have, and snowbirds, people that visit in the winter, is that, I can go out and just catch tarpon any old time. I can get snook anywhere. That's just not the case. It is in some places, but not most of southern Florida. It's not. Our fishing is still seasonal. What happens is our species kind of shift around. So there are better times to be here to catch certain species. And I think that was what most of the questions were. Is like, I'm going to be there at the winter. What can you catch? That kind of thing. So great many questions had to do with the Silver King, tarpon. So I'm going to start right there. I feel like I'm starting at the top maybe. Normally I do it the other way around. I'll start down with the smaller fish and work up. But I think it's worth talking about tarpon right off the bat. Get your attention. So I'm going to start there. I'm also going to do some regional stuff as well. So hang in there for that part. We'll get to all this today, this morning, this evening. This is actually Sunday for me. Super Bowl Sunday. Yay! By the time you hear this, it'll be over, and I have no idea who's going to win. I'm not totally into it this year. The Dolphins aren't there again. I'm sure they ever will be. But I'll be watching. I have to see the ads, got to see the TV ads. That's all part of the Super Bowl. So tarpon are highly migratory. However, some areas of southern Florida and southwest Florida have what's called resident tarpon. Little ones, generally not much bigger than about 25 pounds or so, and most being under 10 pounds. I want to make sure you understand it there. We're talking about a fish that's maybe 15 to 20 inches long is pretty much what you see a lot of, and then over that, it's unusual. But we refer to it down here as the fun size because a big tarpon's a pain in the butt, and after you've caught a few of them, and especially if you don't know what you're doing, you're not sure how to stop them, how to turn them, all that kind of stuff, it does get to be kind of a pain. And as a former fishing guide who took people tarpon fishing, it was, I don't know. I don't want to say it was frustrating because it was fun to watch somebody hook up to one, but it was also entertaining to watch them struggle with something they thought they just reel right into the boat. No, it's not your average everyday fish. It can be a beast, especially if you're in the 80 pounds plus. Somewhere in that range, it's going to be an awful lot of fun. So anyway, big time winter target on the West Coast and some interior freshwater places would be these fun size resident tarpon. They tend to hang out in backwater areas, in skinny water, in creeks and canals and things like that. And they adapt to fresh water. So it's not unusual to find them in drainage ditches and places like that in the wintertime. Again, these are the little fellas. Keep in mind that you're after a fish that needs to have some sort of exit and entrance from salt water. So if you're back in a creek or a lake or something, it's very unlikely that you're going to see these resident tarpon. But if you're closer to the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic Ocean, Florida Bay, and you're in a back area where you're fishing like a drainage area, for example, there's a good chance they'll be in there as long as they have some sort of access to salt water. Your best bet for catching tarpon on the most western side of Florida Bay and down around the Middle Keys out to Key West in the early spring through early summer. However, the big ones are here almost all the time. That makes the Keys a little more desirable for a lot of folks just because the chances of getting a big one can happen most any time. That's because water temperatures down here just don't fluctuate all that much. We don't have that huge swing in temperatures from the middle 80s down to the low 60s sometimes that other places have. Down here, our water temperatures stay pretty constant at 74 to 78 degrees in the winter, and that's because we're up against the Atlantic Ocean, which doesn't get freezing cold. It's just not that susceptible to that because of currents, Gulf Stream, things like that. And that also helps keep the bait around. So that's another reason they hang out here. You know, we've always got some white bait, threadfin herrings, ballyhoo, stuff like that is living here, especially around our bridges and stuff. So it makes it a little easier to find a bigger one down here year round than it does just about anywhere else. The migration to the North Gulf Coast starts around March, depending on weather. Now, I'm talking about the Keys tarpon, the ones that are down in this area that are pretty happy all winter long, hanging out. You know, they eventually, as the weather warms and the days get longer, they start to head north up the Gulf Coast. And these schools move up along the 10,000 Islands, Marco, Naples. Soon they reach Bonita Beach, and then Fort Myers Beach, and then Sanibel, and on after that, of course. I studied the Sanibel stop for quite a while now. I even included it in my first book about how to fish Southwest Florida, and that's what I call it. It's like the Sanibel stop. For some reason, these big fish seem to lollygag in this area for weeks before moving up north. Not all of them now, but a great many of them. Here's my thoughts along with some scientific research I read. The lower coastline of Sanibel is east-west. I know it's kind of weird. Sanibel's a boot, all right? So you have the east-west bottom, and then at Knapp's Point, it turns and goes north. And then you have a north-south shoreline. Fort Myers Beach is to the east of that. So you have a wall right there of north-south with an opening into San Carlos Bay. So you have this kind of natural trap. It's a curve. So you take Sanibel's coastline east-west and you just draw a picture from left to right. You hit Fort Myers Beach, you draw the line down. Now you have a little cup basically. And the average water depth in that area is about 15 to 18 feet. And there are an absolute ton of threadfin herrings, and they get trapped in that general area. It's very general now. It's not, you don't just run into the middle of it and run up to the coast there, but that whole area just seems to bottle the tarpon up for a while. And I to me, it's a feeding area. Why would they go? Why would you leave? They're everywhere at that time. It can last for a few weeks, a couple months, again, depending on weather. And it starts at different times, too. March can be cold on the West Coast. You can have late cold fronts that just completely screw it up. However, they can come really early. So those tarpons simply move to follow the bait that's going into warmer water. So it's hard for me to pinpoint a time, but I can tell you that migration generally starts in March. It can be as late as April, but the high spot for the west coast of Florida, around Fort Myers Beach, Sanibel, Captiva, that general area is usually around May. And that's a lot of people key on getting their guides lined up so they can go tarpon fishing in May. Some of the fish break away into smaller pods, and they will move out of that area and move inside. They'll go up into San Carlos Bay, they'll go up into the Caloosahatchee River, and they'll go up into Pine Island Sound. These are still very large fish. There's certain areas you can fish, but it's better if you just hire a guide and get somebody to show you the ropes on this. But you just pay attention to the top of the water and see what's around. You see bait flicking around in a back bay area that's got 4 feet of water, 5 feet, 6 feet of water in it. There's a really good chance you're going to see a tarpon roll in those areas, but it's also a great place to fish for them. On the outside, the fish move up toward Blind Pass. That's the pass between Captiva and Sanibel. And you'll also find them up, of course, at the famous Boca Grande Pass. Yeah, not Grande. Okay, it's spelled Grande. If it's pronounced Grand, Boca Grande Pass. If you say Grande Pass, everybody knows you ain't from around there. So try to do your best to call it Boca Grande Pass. Honestly, that's probably the best place to fill that empty spot on the bucket list. Other than maybe Robbie's and Ala Mirada, but you can't fish there. That was a joke. But not my cup of tea. At Boca Grande, there are just way too many boats in one spot with a lot of anglers that have no idea what they're doing. If you're going to fish there, hire a guide. It's insanity. Go on the web, go to YouTube, pull up Boca Grande Pass tarpon, and just do a little video thing, and you'll immediately understand what's going on at that location. Also, keep in mind the islands of Sanibel and Captiva are also very popular shore fishing locations for passing tarpon. It'll be tough access this spring after Hurricane Ian, but most likely doable. They're starting to open the beaches up now, so by the time things warm up, we should be good to go. I recently saw a post on social media that had a few of the beaches open. That's why I said that. Actually, I think there were only 2 beaches, but word has it that they eventually will get to Bowman's Beach and Turner's. That was 2 of my favorites, and I don't believe they're open yet. So you want to kind of keep an eye on that if you're a shore fisherman. There's also a big migration on the East Coast as well that revolves around the mullet migration. So this is kind of radically different than the West Coast. Talking fish, not hairstyles here. The mullet, okay, you get it. It's also known as the mullet run. It happens at different times along the coast and is a move toward the south, not the north, typically. Peak would be about August for Jacksonville, and then September around Canaveral, October through November in South Florida. And once again, it's important to keep an eye on the weather and, of course, fishing reports. The mullet run is big business on the East Coast, so there's a lot of info about it on Facebook, Instagram, and the web. So basically what happens is as these mullets start to come south, the tarpon come to meet them in gigantic schools. It's hard to believe. I saw an aerial shot from a drone a couple of years ago. It was just thousands of these mullet and thousands of tarpon. It was incredible. Along Pompano Beach, I believe, is where the guy filmed it. But so it's a collision is what it is, and it's tricky. So you really have to pay attention to reports, water temperature, things like that to make this work. And by the way, huge snook also feed on those mullet. So on the East Coast, this is a big deal. You know, your snook tarpon thing kind of happens all because of this mullet run. Want to catch one on fly? Get your tarpon in the Keys. I prefer the waters around Ala Mirada, especially Florida Bay, but I know those waters better than others, so there you go. The easiest way to hook up with a tarpon is on live bait. It's plain and simple. They have a lot of small crabs, and stuff like that here for sale. So you don't have, you can buy bait, but tarpon love them. They love small crabs. They love pinfish. They love threadfin herrings. Cut bait like catfish and mullet also work, especially on the West Coast, like in the Caloosahatchee River and in these more inland water areas. Cut baits work really, really well. Little trickier to figure out for first-time tarpon anglers, but I don't know. It's like follow the boats. I always say that. One last tarpon migration tip. The big fish also turn around and head back to warm waters late in the fall on the west coast. So say around September, October, when the water starts to cool up in the panhandle, there's this weird small window on the west coast where they start traveling south again. And they usually come by the Fort Myers, Sanibel, Captiva area. Well, again, it's weather dependent, but September, October, let's just give you a window. And it only lasts a couple weeks. It's really funny. It's a great time to get a tarpon, to get your bucket list done on a tarpon from your own boat all by your lonesome, because these fish are going by almost constantly for 2 weeks and they're hungry. You just have to be out in the Gulf, not very far, maybe a mile or two offshore, and you'll see these roving schools. And what are they doing? They know winter's coming and they've turned around, they're going the other way, and they're heading back down to the Florida Keys. Okay, let's break this part down. When's the best time to catch snook in Florida? I get that question a lot. And where? First, snook are not cold tolerant. Let's just get that out of the way. They are just like a native Floridian. They don't like swimming in waters in the 60s and will most likely not survive water temperatures below 60 degrees. The west coast of Florida has had some pretty nasty fish kills when nighttime temps stay in the low 40s for an extended period of time. So please keep that. It's all good right now. We haven't had any major cold snaps this winter. It's got cold back around Christmas, but not enough to kill off populations of fish. So the when question, when, W-H-E-N, when? Spring, summer, and fall is okay. When or not? Simple. Unless you're all the way down in the Keys or on the lower east Florida coast, like Fort Lauderdale and Miami. As I mentioned before, the Atlantic stays in the lower 70s in those areas, so snook are pretty happy there. You can catch snook all along the beaches of Fort Lauderdale and Miami, down around Biscayne, pretty much year-round. That's not a big deal. It would take a pretty major winter problem down that way to push them way inside. On the West Coast, that's a whole different ballgame, so let's talk about that. I'll start with winter. December through February, snook are hiding way in the backcountry. They're in the creeks, and places like that, especially if they are spring-fed from groundwater. So in other words, if the creek has got some sort of spring coming out of, and most of our springs are in the high 60s to low 70, like 68 to 70 degrees, that's where they'll be. But they're not in a big feeding mood, so don't get all excited about that. But there's a chance you might find them in there. That keeps the water temperatures above that death threshold I was talking about. It also means that snook are going to feed all that much. They aren't going to feed all that much. They just, it's all about metabolism, people. Fish are cold-blooded, and they only eat what they need. When the water temperature drops, their body temperature drops, and their metabolism slows down. So they just don't need that kind of energy. Like, here comes science. Yeah, I know. So I've explained it. That's pretty much how it works. When that water temperature starts to go up, fish get hungry. It's very simple. Also, bait kind of disappears when the water gets cold. There's just not as much of it. It goes out into the Gulf and goes down deep to deeper water, and that keeps it happy. When things start to warm up, the bait starts to move in too. So it all kind of works together. Along about early March, the snook are getting a bit hungry. Water's warming. Bait's moving about. Snook start moving out of their cold water safety areas and are headed for the beaches. This isn't only for food, though. It's also for spawning. Snook spawn mostly in May along our beaches. Please note I said mostly. Again, this is weather dependent, so it can happen a little earlier, it can happen a little later, or the start can. But it will generally, those fish will stay on that beach all summer long until the first cold snaps start to come in. And generally, in my rule of thumb, was the second cold snap that start to push them. So the first one, not so much because the water doesn't drop that much. The second one, the water temperature starts to fall a little bit, not to mention the days are getting shorter. So these fish start to migrate, and that's when they're heading back inside. Activity is high along the beaches. It's one of my favorite things to do in the summertime is snook fish on the beaches of the West Coast. You've got all the way from Boca Grande south into the 10,000 Islands. You will find snook along every edge you can imagine that borders the Gulf of Mexico. And the beach. Yeah, sand beaches, that's my favorite thing. You know, the little rocky edges of the ledges, the cuts, the little tiny passes, they're okay, but the beach is a blast. It's sight fishing at its best. You get yourself a really good pair of polarized sunglasses, get your gear together, especially if you like to fly fish, stuff like that. You can sight fish these fish. You got to be stealthy. You got to be quiet. Sometimes you have to crouch down when you're walking. You know, they can see you too, boy. And if they see you, they're not going to eat. So, but I love going after them along beaches. What does snook eat? Shrimp, live swimming bait. I think live swimming bait be number one, actually. White bait, you know, and threadfin herrings, they love those too. They also like cut ladyfish. That's something that most people don't put into books or talk about very much on fishing reports. But if you catch ladyfish, which is a very aggressive, easy to catch fish on the west coast of most coast of Florida, you can cut it into little steaks and put those on a circle hook and toss them out there. And Mr. Snook will certainly eat them. They love cut ladyfish. One rule, if you're going to go with artificials, pick something that looks like a live bait, both in size and color. It's called Matching the Hatch by longtime fly fishermen. You want soft plastics, for example, in pearly white. I mostly use Z-Man's, Gulp, and DOA, but again, stick with something that has the overall shape of a small fish, and you'll do well if you're messing around with artificials. Moving right along, let's do redfish. Mr. Redfish, also called the red drum, are much more cold tolerant than snook. Let me put this in perspective for those of you that like to fish freshwater from Georgia to Ohio, for example, for bass. There are you know, they're big old largemouth bass. How can I explain? Yeah, redfish. Redfish are just big old largemouth bass with a reddish colored skin, but they're a hell of a lot better fighters, in my opinion. Okay, I got all the bass people all wound up now. They tolerate colder water, but prefer warm. So it's this weird thing. They can be caught in Louisiana in the winter. They can be caught on the Carolina coast in the winter. You know, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. So it's not like they don't die in cold. It's got to be extremely cold to put a redfish off. But they do go right back to the metabolism thing. They're like, okay, well, I don't need to eat so much right now because it's cold. So, of course, warmer water works a whole lot better. They'll eat most anything that gets in their way. Sound familiar, bass folks? But they prefer crustaceans. Shrimp and crabs are absolutely their favorite. And don't get me wrong now, they'll go after white bait in a hurry, but grubbing on the bottom is what they really like to do. They just pull a photo of one up on the web and you know, red drum redfish, and look at their face. Check out the nose. They use that to push through a silty bottom of shallow water grass flats, and then they eat whatever pops out of the mud. Also note the position of their mouth. It's below the snout and slightly under it, not facing forward like a snook or a tarpon, but more downward. So I much prefer going after them with live shrimp on a lead head jig. Cast around mangroves, and then left on the bottom right after the cast. Wait for a long, agonizing 30 seconds, or maybe more. A whole minute seems like an eternity when you're fishing, but just then barely move it. I mean, barely, like half of a crank. Let it sit and move it again. If there's a red anywhere nearby, you'll soon feel a heavy punch on the line. Set the hook. They're watchful. They're not real, like supercharging aggressive like a snook is on a bait. So when you put that on the bottom and you do a little dragging in the sand, you create a little tiny bit of dust, and that's what gets his attention. He looks over and he goes, what was that? Comes over a little closer. You move it again, and he's like, oh, it's a shrimp. Boom, and they eat. So the trick is to go slow. Take your time with redfish. Let the bait sit for a little bit. Don't get over anxious. Start winding stuff in immediately. There are redfish on the east coast of Florida as well. Highest concentrations around Canaveral, Mosquito Lagoon. But there have been some water issues up that way for about 10 years now, and the catches have decreased. However, they seem to be doing a little better. I don't want to put you off. Mosquito Lagoon is a great place to get a giant redfish. They're working on that. Hopefully, they'll be fishing for reds more often than not. But the word up there has been a little difficult. So before you go to Mosquito Lagoon in that area, please check with local guides, find out the skinny on it, see what they're up to there. But they're definitely available there. The Keys also have them. They're plentiful all across the entire Florida Bay system. We sight fish them here, which can be fun and frustrating all at the same time. But not only can you see them, they can see you. So they have a really, it's clear water, so it makes it a little tougher. I like going after them from March until November on the far back flats where there's quite a bit of silty mud. This is in the Keys now. This is Upper Florida Bay. Stingrays like to cruise those areas looking for food on the bottom, and they kick up this muddy trail behind them. The reds and big jacks like to follow them and grab whatever the rays miss. So the rays are feeding, pushing through this mud. Stuff comes out of the back like an exhaust pipe behind the rays, and they're followed by these reds and these jacks who pick up whatever they can. We call it fishing mudding rays. I mean, it's, we're going mudding today, and people look at you, what? You're going like four-wheeling? No. We're going mudding, which is fishing for reds and stuff behind rays. It requires a really good ability to cast on the part of the angler. Please keep this in mind. You must drop that bait or artificial just behind the ray without hitting the ray. Otherwise, it'll be time to hunt for another mudding ray. They're real easy to see. They leave streaks across the water. If you're up high enough on your boat, like on a poling platform or just standing up on like a seat, they're pretty easy to spot. Look like contrails, like jets in the sky kind of contrails all across the mud. Figure out which way it's going. Set yourself up to intercept without making a whole lot of noise, which means trolling motors and push poles work best. And then once you get set, you just wait for that ray to get there and then make the best cast you can possibly make. They prefer crabs and shrimp, like I said, but they'll go for a host of artificials, like the soft plastic stuff. I've had a lot of luck with gulp swimming mullet in both that pearl white color and new penny. But slow down and give the bait a chance to fall all the way to the bottom and work it like I said before. I have never had much luck radically working something in front of a redfish. They tend to really, they're ambush feeders. So they tend to hang in there and they tend to be very watchful. And you really want to take your time to be successful with reds. Sea trout, I told you I was moving down the list here. So they're far and away the easiest fish to catch in the saltwater of Florida. Anywhere in Florida. There are ranges everywhere. They especially like the waters from Tampa on down to the 10,000 Islands, but they're certainly found in Jacksonville, all along the upper coast of the Panhandle, Fort Lauderdale, down in Biscayne Bay. I mean, you can get sea trout just about anywhere in the state of Florida. They feed on small swimming fish the size of minnows. That's one of their favorite things. They'll go after sardines. They'll go after threads if they're small enough. Obviously, shrimp is high on the list as well. And artificial shrimp work really well for going after trout. So put a live shrimp on a hook under a popping cork, and you're pretty much good to go. Sea trout are cold water tolerant. Although the metabolism thing I mentioned while talking about snook and reds still applies. They feed well in the winter months as long as water doesn't drop into the middle to lower 60s. So in other words, it won't kill them. They just slow down eating like any cold water species. They tend to school up in small groups on grass flats. The best way to locate them for personally recommendation for you is drifting, using a drift boat just to drift across the flat. Simply find a big open grass flat or something the buddies recommended to you, or the guy at the tackle shop says, yeah, try this area. He'll be very vague, of course, but you'll get the general idea. Big open grass flat where the water depth ranges from about 2 to 6 feet. So 2 feet shallow, 6 feet deep. Go to the upwind end of the flat, shut down the motor, and then drift while casting. So let the wind and the current push you wherever it may go. You get a trout, drop the hook or power pole, and work that area around the boat thoroughly. Like I said, they kind of pocket up in one spot. They don't move around a whole lot. If you get the right spot, you're talking a dozen fish. Sometimes as many as 20 of them will all be in that one area. And when the bite winds down, you caught them all. Plain and simple. They don't generally move away. They just keep eating. And they don't, not wily like snook. They don't go and warn the other snook, oh man, Joe just got caught. Y'all might want to move out of this area. Sea trout don't do that. They just gang up when they find out there's food around. It's really pretty simple. And you'll also get your share of ladyfish, small sharks. The bonnetheads usually run with these fish, jacks, lizardfish, and you might even pick up a redfish doing this. So when it comes to artificial baits, I like soft plastics that have a curly tail on them that I can put on a jig head. I adjust the weight for the jig to depth. Cast and retrieve, the little twitches. Cast it out there, let it hit the water. Do some real subtle little tip bumps with your wrist. Real tip bumps, that kind of thing to keep the jig kind of moving and dancing. And then I adjust the weights for depth. So if I'm going to put a jig head on there, a little heavier for deeper water, a little lighter for shallow. Gulp and DOA are my go-tos. Gulp makes a shrimp. The new penny is my favorite color in that. DOA, there's one that's kind of a chocolatey brown color that's got gold metal flake in it. I don't think it has a name. That's one of my favorites. I really like throwing that for them. So, let's see. Oh, here's another question I get very often. I'm coming down in February. That's how it starts. You're like, oh no. I've heard that some game fish don't like colder water. See, they got informed by somebody, friend or whatever. What do I do? What do I go after? This is good. I like this because when all else fails, there's no tarpon migrating, the snook are hiding, the redfish are going, yeah, I'm not interested in eating right now. And the same thing with sea trout. You can always fall back to two species, sheep's head and pompano. Now, sheep's head, not to be mistaken for the freshwater sheephead. It's spelled, it's sheep's head in saltwater. They're plentiful in the winter months, especially along the southwest Florida coastlines. Also on the East Coast, you'll catch them on the east, especially if you've got anywhere that's got barnacle bottom or some sort of rock structure that's got crustacean-y type stuff on it and barnacles and things like that. It's one of my go-tos around Fort Myers. Here's what makes them interesting and catchable from about Christmas through March. They spawn in the winter. They do that near shore and come into the back bays looking for food. They love shrimp, crabs, but mostly, oddly enough, barnacles. That's right, good old-fashioned barnacles, annoying barnacles. The old-timers like me would scrape dock pilings on the very low tides and then use the scrapings for chum. Works like a charm. Just watch your knuckles. Use a long-handled scraper when you're doing this. Barnacles are unforgiving if you scrape your hand on them. One thing to note here, sheepies don't go after artificials. Well, maybe a well-placed fly that looks like a small shrimp. I've seen the fly guys get away with this, but in the world of spin fishing, it's virtually impossible. You'll get one every now and then on a fake shrimp, but it's very, very rare. I and others have made that work with the fly, but not so much spin. Anyhow, they're delicious, but a pain to fillet, literally. They have an enormous spine on the back and a spine right near the anal fin area. And if you're holding it the wrong way and you move your hand the wrong way, you're going to get jabbed. We call that sheep's head's revenge, and that's pretty much what it is. But man, oh man, are they good. Pearly white meat, very mild, very tasty. You will see guys go out to do nothing but sheep's head in the winter. They'll forget all the rest of that stuff we just talked about and concentrate on sheep's head because they're looking for dinner. Size ranges are 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds, all the way up to 8 pounds would be a really nice one. I've seen 10 pounders, but realistically 7 or 8's a really good size one. I haven't fished for sheep's head in so long, I can't tell you limits. I know they've cut it back some, and I know the size. I think the size now is still 12 inches overall, but I'm not real sure about that. You want to check your size and stuff, but really, really good. Best for finding them along long strips of exposed oyster bars in backwaters and in Gulf waters of about 10 to 15 feet with lots of debris on the bottom. So in other words, when you go in the back country, you have those long, skinny oyster bars are everywhere. Usually the tops of them are poking out of the water in the wintertime on low tides. That's a really good sheep's head location. Because again, they're barnacle, crustacean, crab eaters, small scallops, anything they can get their mouth on. They got an outrageous mouth, by the way, loaded with big teeth. And it hurts if you get bit, so be careful. They call it sheep's head for a reason because the mouth looks like the mouth of a sheep. It's pretty daggone scary. In the, let's see, I'll give you one good spot, the May Reef off of Southwest Florida's coast, off of Fort Myers Beach. The May Reef has been there for years. This is a known spot. I'm not giving away any big secret here. The waters out there are 10 to 15 feet, sometimes 18 feet, depending on the tide. It's a really, really great area to pick up sheepies. Put a small, tiny little jig on, put some shrimp on, a piece of shrimp. Don't waste a whole shrimp on sheep's head. They'll just nibble it off. Put a little piece of shrimp on and drop it down to the bottom and keep your fingers crossed. If you've got a depth finder that'll mark the little rock piles, that's what you want. Just find one of those rock piles and sit on it. But it really works pretty good. I used to fish the May Reef quite a bit, and that was one of my winter go-to spots, especially when things were tough. When the other fish just were like, I am not going to do this sheep's head will. Pompano. Pompano. Yeah, I have to tell you this story. The reason I do that, every time somebody mentions pompano, I yell that way, pompano. There's a story that goes with this. I had a young lady on the boat. She was really very excited about fishing, and she wanted to catch pompano for dinner. And I went out into an area. I'm not even going to talk about where it was, but I was surrounded by other anglers because everybody's kind of doing that. They're searching for pompano. Pompano move in schools. It's good to know that they're kind of tight schools. You'll see them skipping on top of the water. That's a dead giveaway that pompano are around. But once you find them, you're kind of lucky. You do a lot of drift fishing in a boat to find these things. They love 4 to 5 feet of water that's got a sandy bottom because they love to grub in the sand for small crabs, sand fleas, and the like. This is on the West Coast now. So I was fishing there, and she hooked a fish. It came up to the surface, and she squealed real loud, pompano, and every person in every boat around us looked, and I'm like, oh no. You shouldn't have done that. Anyway, she was terribly embarrassed. The other people you could hear them chuckling and laughing because it was like, okay, she had no idea what the rules are. And needless to say, they were suddenly in my drift. So anyway, that's just how it goes. So every time I hear the word pompano, I laugh because it happened. In winter, cooler weather, pompano are quite active, unlike other fish. Again, they love to grub along the bottom, along our beaches. Anywhere you have a sand inlet of about 4 to 5 feet of water, that wonderful, you look down in the sands, that wavy sand, there's nothing else in the way. That's where you typically find them in the wintertime. Their favorite food is a thing called a sand flea. They absolutely love them, and they usually find those buried in the sand about maybe an inch or two under the sand. So that's why they're down there grubbing on the bottom. Usually create a little sand trail behind them when they're doing this. In the springtime, pompano will be running from south to the north, chasing water temperatures. Their ideal temp range is 68 to 75 degrees. Just keep that in mind. If you can stay somewhere in that temperature range, you have a really good chance of finding pomps. I watch the reports is what I used to do from the south to the north as they move around. And as the waters cool, the pomps just head further north. This also happens on the East Coast, so it's real important. The fall pompano run, which everyone talks about, is simply everything in reverse. The fish are way up, and they start to come south in the fall because the water's hot. Okay, it's backwards from what your thinking is. In the fall, they're up north, and the reason they're up there for the summer is because the water is cooler off of Jacksonville in that area. And then as the water starts to cool off, they move south because, again, they're looking for that gradient of 68 to about 75 degrees. They like that little notch. And we're only talking about, what is that? 70, 68, not even, good grief, not even 10 degrees. So they're trying to stay in this area, and they move that way. So when that temperature reaches that perfect temp between 68 and 75, you're going to find a lot of pompano. So that's the fall pompano run. They're on their way past Stewart on the East Coast, and as the waters cool down, they head south. They'll usually stop along Pompano Beach. Imagine that. Can't imagine how it got its name. They stay a bit longer there. They're waiting for the temps to go lower than 75 degrees. They hit the beaches along Fort Lauderdale. So now Fort Lauderdale is kind of a weird situation. I lived there and I fished there quite a bit twice. I've lived there 2 times. And pompano are tricky there because sometimes that water never gets cold enough. The daggone water along, if you don't have any kind of winter snap or winter current or anything that can push against the Gulf Stream, the water just never really gets cold enough to really give those fish a chance to come in large schools. However, if that water temperature drops down to about 70 degrees, oh my goodness, there's pompano everywhere along the beaches of Fort Lauderdale. So keep that in mind. It can be very, very tough to get fish that far south, pompano, that far south in the wintertime. Best baits, as I mentioned, sand fleas. You can buy them. The guys have them frozen typically. You can thaw them out. You can also use a thing called a sand flea rake. And when you go down to the beach, you basically put this thing in the water into the sand, dig it down to the sand, and draw it towards you, and the sand fleas will be trapped in the bottom of the rake. If you get them that way, you're doing great. I used to like to scope the beaches, depending on, no matter where I was on the East Coast, look at the beach and look for carcasses of sand fleas. They'll wash up. You'll just hit an area. You go, oh wow, there's another one. That's a good spot. You know that if there's carcasses rolling around up on the beach in the surf, that there's a real good chance that you're going to find pompano out in the water itself, of course. Something else that's really different about fishing the East Coast for pompano is instead of using your typical spin rod with your typical small jig and a rig like you would use on the West Coast of Florida, now you're going to graduate to an 11 to 12-foot rod, a surf casting rod, specially made, a surf casting reel, specially made. The edge of the reel is flared in a way to let the line go further when you cast. You're going to haul back and let that sucker go and get it as far off the shore as you can possibly get it. It's very entertaining to if you get it right, you can't see the splash of your weight when it hits the water. And speaking of weight, you're going to use really, really big weights. We talking like slivers of ounces in the Keys and the West Coast, unless you're offshore on a reef. But typically what we're talking about here is something that's an eighth of an ounce, a quarter of an ounce. You're going to use a full ounce to 5 ounces of weight in a pyramid sinker when you pompano fish. It's a funny rig. It's got a weight at the very bottom, and then you have two side lines hanging off that'll have your hooks on them. Or something to attract pompano. Yellow is a good color. Yellow is really a good color. And then you're going to have your bait on there, and you're going to toss that as far as you can. The reason the weights vary from like 1 ounce to bigger is current. If you have a high surf, if you have 3-footers coming in toward the beach, you can still fish for pompano, but you don't want the wave to roll your weight in. You don't want it to be bringing the line to you every time a wave action or current comes across your weight. So on a calmer day, you can use a 1 ounce weight. On windier days or when the water's being pushed toward the beach, then you're going to have to break down and put on like a 3 ouncer or a 4 ouncer. And boy, that's fun to cast, but that's how you get it done. So keep that in mind. I really enjoy doing that. In the backcountry bays of, say, the West Coast for pompano, you're looking for areas that have really good current, and the current moves through natural ditches on flats. Okay, so you're not so much like the oyster bar areas, although you will catch them there occasionally when you're hunting for sheepies. But you're looking for areas that are broad flats that have those natural cuts that the water moves through, like from north to south, east to west, when the current's running, when tides are running through there, or even when winds are pushing it. So you're looking for natural ditches on flats, and you set up on the edge of those ditches and work the ditches. Also keep your eyes open. Like I said, pompano flash because they're silvery in color. You'll see them rotate up on the surface to try to get away from bad things like sharks and dolphins, and things will start to come onto the flat. So keep your eyes open when you're looking for it. Best secondary bait. If you can't get sand fleas, that's primarily an East Coast kind of thing. You'll get those on the West Coast beaches too if you dig for them. You will. Shrimp. Good old-fashioned live shrimp. I like live, not frozen. Live shrimp, cut it into 3 pieces. So if the shrimp's large enough, you got a head, middle, and tail. You pin that on a small jig. I like using yellow. I call it Yum Yum Yellow. Pompano key on small crabs that are in roe, R-O-E. What that means is they have eggs on the bottom of them. And the crabs themselves, the eggs are like on their tummies. It's hard to explain, but it's yellowishy orange in color. And so pompano really, really key on that color. So if you can get a jig that's somewhere around yellow, yellowish orange, or orangey in color, that's what you want to use. And then pin your shrimp on there, just a piece. You don't need a lot. And gently move it across the bottom. You want to create a sand trail that'll keep them coming. Some rules and regulations to pass along before I wrap this up. Just about every fish in Florida has a regulation attached to it. Be sure to check the rules before keeping fish and make sure you know what they are. Yeah, IDing them is pretty important. We have a lot of fish that look alike. Speaking of pompano, you can also get jacks. You don't want to eat a jack. Well, some people do, but I definitely don't care for it. Anyway, if you're not sure what a species is, put it back in the water, okay? We got serious size limits in this state, bag limits, seasons, for almost all of our game fish. You'll also need a fishing license to fish from shore or on water unless you are 15 years old or younger. Also, some fishing piers do include day licenses. Be sure to ask if they are included when you purchase your ticket to fish on the pier. Catch and release is big here in Florida. Please only keep legal fish for a meal or two. All right. Filling up the cooler is pretty much a thing of the past around here now. So people, got to respect the catch. We got to make sure we got plenty in there for grandkids and kids and ourselves for that matter. So put it back if you're not going to eat it, and then go back out and catch it on another day. So there you go. Thanks much for the notes with some really good questions. I really appreciate the mail I'm getting. Keep them coming, and I'll do my best to answer via Catch Outdoors. You can email me, catchoutdoors.com, by the way. But you can also contact me via the Catch Outdoors on Facebook. I'll be more than happy to answer questions there as well. So anyway, until next week, y'all have fun. It's time for me to sign off. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in. My podcasts are scheduled for each and every Tuesday. If you enjoyed listening, please tell a friend, leave a review, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Catch Outdoors is presented by the Waypoint Podcast Network. It's available on Waypoint and many of your favorite podcast providers. The Facebook page is Catch Outdoors, website waypointtv.com, and catchoutdoors.com. Until next time, get outdoors and enjoy.